And then we'll, thank you. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Zoom forum. We wanted to bring forward uh, our guest speakers in this time of emergency. In the past, over the years, in times when one doesn't know quite what to do, the best way to start is to move toward those who are involved, who are on the ground, who are following what's going on, who are able to provide their insight. And so we turn to our three guest speakers in a forum that includes you as constituents, people who've been part of Rebuilding Alliance's work, people who've been calling their members of Congress. And our hope is to use this forum to understand more about this level of violence and escalation, but more importantly, think about and talk about how we as Americans can reach to our members of Congress and press them into action that actually is useful and helpful, that can help stand down, make things safer, and bring about justice and even peace. So big goals for our guest speakers, but certainly help us understand what is occurring here. What I'd like to do is to introduce all three of our speakers. And in the speaking order, it'll be our colleague from the UN speaking first, then from Yashdin, and then Asil from El-Haq. Let me bring forward your bios and tell our audience a little bit more about you. And I'm happy to say that Andrea De Domenico is from UN OCHA. He's the acting head of the UN OCHA office in the occupied Palestinian territory. Oh man, I always office. You're going to have to go through OCHA again of what it stands for. It's the one acronym that will throw me at any moment. He's been
the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Yes, of course. He's been working in the OPT for the last 3.5 years, managing the overall operations of the Office of Coordinating of Humanitarian Affairs across the West Bank and Gaza. Andrea joined OCHA more than 16 years ago, and he contributed in developing and expanding OCHA's humanitarian funding function globally when serving in New York and in the DRC when serving as their fund manager. Before joining the UN, Andrea worked in international NGOs in Ecuador, Albania, Kosovo, Switzerland, Pakistan, and the DR Congo. He holds a BA in International Law from Paris 9 XI and a MA in Political Science from the University of Padova, MA in International Relations from Luis Rome. Andrea is married and has 3 children. I'm also really heartened to welcome Dan Owen, who's with Yashdin. He's a senior researcher at Yashdin. Dan Owen grew up in Jerusalem. He has a master's degree in politics and governance from Ben Gurion University and has been part of several initiatives against the Israeli occupation. In the past couple of years, Dan has been a researcher at Yashdin. He's the author of In Bad Faith and Investigating Themselves. His main focus is the lack of accountability concerning settler and military violence against Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. Also, I'm really honored to bring forward Asil Al-Baj, a legal researcher and advocacy officer at El-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organization that many of you are familiar with. She holds an LLM in international human rights law from the National University of Ireland, Galway. In addition to her academic research, which focused on transitional justice and decolonization in Palestine, she writes opinion articles for several media outlets. Welcome to each of our distinguished speakers, and I'd like to especially encourage Andrea, please go ahead and begin your presentation to give us an overview of what has been taking place, what the trends are that you see.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for finding the time to join us tonight. or this morning for you, afternoon. Do you see my screen, Donna? Just
Yes.
thanks. So I'll try to walk you through in few minutes on the current situation as we see it from our perspective. And of course, we focus as Office of Humanitarian Affairs of the United Nations. We focus on the humanitarian aspect of it. We start first of all, I would say, locating the where we are. You know, the occupied Palestinian territory is made of two territories that, but they are supposed to be one entity, one geographic entity. And as you can see in the map, you have the Gaza Strip, which is quite renowned and famous, unfortunately, for the sequence of escalation of violence and conflict that happens. And then you have the West Bank occupied territory, which include East Jerusalem, according to the international community and the United Nations. What we have, the way we characterize the situation in the Palestinian occupied territories is we call them a protection crisis, which Donna told me a couple of times, you know, you have to unpack this. What does it mean? And basically, this means that is a place, unfortunately, where we see systematic denial of basic rights and lack of respect of international humanitarian law and international human rights. The humanitarian community has identified three fundamental elements, components that characterize this this protection crisis, and the ones you can see on the screen, which are the threats to life and liberty and personal security. I will elaborate further later on. The loss of land, home, and livelihood that leads to the forced displacement of Palestinians, which in terms of international humanitarian law, it's a war crime. And then restricted movement and access to services and assistance, which is one of the work that my office tries constantly with partners to work with the authorities in order to have access for those services for Palestinians. The trends, and tonight I will focus primarily, which is unfortunately unusual, but I will focus primarily on West Bank, because Gaza, you might all have heard, when there are escalations and conflict that explode, it's basically warfare, war in some shape and form. But what we have seen recently speaks more about the situation in the West Bank, and the concerns that we are now having are more focused on the West Bank, that of course can have a trigger and an impact on Gaza, but for the time being, likely have not. So I will define some underlying causes of and trends that are very worrisome from our perspective, that are particularly affecting West Bank. As you can see on the graph on the screen, this year we have more than 100 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. The data are updated as early of October. 103 is already outdated, unfortunately, but we didn't update every day this presentation. This has been, this year has marked the deadliest year since 2016, in the last 16 years, if you compare the monthly average of fatalities that have occurred in the West Bank. It represents a 57% increase on monthly average compared to last year, which is quite worrisome and impressive. More than 60% of the fatalities that occurred across the West Bank has happened during military operation and search and arrest operation. Now, search and arrest operation, military operations, means basically that IDF, so the Israeli Defense Forces, the army, intervenes in area, in Palestinian communities in area A and B, which are in theory, the areas under the control of the Palestinian authorities, looking for individuals that might have committed crimes or are suspected to be linked to people that have committed crimes. And in this doing, they trigger, of course, the reaction of the population or the reaction of the individuals that they have been tracking. And what we've witnessed this year is an incredible increase of use of live ammunition, not only from the military side, but also from the Palestinian side. And that, of course, has an immediate impact in terms of number of incidents and unfortunately fatalities among Palestinians. There's been a lot of talking about why this has happened. That, you know, there were media reports about the possibility that this was triggered by the fact that rules of engagement have changed. These are unconfirmed information because, of course, rules of engagement are something that is covered by confidentiality. But what we have seen for sure is the impact on civilians and civilian populations. Most recently, 2 Israeli soldiers were killed in checkpoints, one in Rafah and one in Nablus. And that has triggered a series of operations that have caused military operations that were looking for those individuals that were involved in this, that have, of course, triggered a lot of conflict. We have had in the first 9 days of October, 10 days of October, we had 9 casualties on the Palestinian side. Most of these fatalities, unfortunately, are happening in refugee camps. So, as you know, within the West Bank, there are a series of refugee camps that are camps inhabited by Palestinians that left in 48, were forced to leave Israel, and then they relocate themselves in West Bank. And of course, those populations have kept on growing. And those refugee camps were served by a UN entity called UNRWA that is taking care of refugees. Of course, those are very highly populated areas where most of these activities have happened, and of course the impact on civilian has been extremely concerning. We have also unfortunately quite a considerable number of fatalities of children. So far we had 28 children killed this year, and you know, at times, children are involved in throwing stones, but the immediate response is unfortunately very violent and with live ammunition. This is, of course, has backed repeatedly our concerns about the use of excessive use of force, because there are other means to control situations of, you know, of public order. And shooting is for sure, and shooting on the upper part of the body, which is also something that happens systematically, is not for sure the first way to quell this type of behavior. Another impact, of course, of the use of live ammunition is not only in terms of fatalities, but also in terms of live ammunitions. Injuries caused by live ammunitions. And again, you can see that the 2022 is quite high. 2021 has been particularly high because there was, if you remember, in May 21, there was a war in Gaza that has, of course, impacted also heavily on West. There were more than 8,000 injuries during May 2021, and most of them, or part of them, were with live ammunition. But the trend has continued, and you can see that 2022 is the highest if we exclude this peak of 2021 in the context of the war. Settler violence, I know that colleagues would speak more about settler violence. Settler violence are also a have increased systematically. You see, we are here, and as of September, this data is as of September, and we are almost at the same level of last year. And last year was already an unprecedented high level of settler violence. Settler violence normally starts with attacks perpetrated by settlers against Palestinians that sees then the intervention of IDF, so the army, and instead the army of separating the groups and trying to protect the civilians. It ends up, unfortunately, with the army contributing to or participating to this conflict and clashes. That starts with tear gas, a rubber bullet, and unfortunately end up on the use of live ammunition. Since the beginning of October, one Palestinian child was killed and 53 people were injured by Israeli forces in settler-related incidents. So settlers have been gathering daily at main junction around Nablus, creating significant fear among Palestinians that no longer travel safely in these roads. And no later than this afternoon, there was another attack against Palestinian and Israeli volunteers that were in Bethlehem supporting Palestinians to pick olives. And settlers have attacked these volunteers, and they have stabbed one individual. So it's a constant trend that is, of course, one of the underlying causes of these tense situations. Demolition is another trend that resonates with the intention of Israeli to relocate and remove Palestinians from their land. As of now, as you can see, structure demolished almost 700 structures have been demolished, creating and displacing 800 people have been displaced so far, including 400 children. The number, of course, of people affected by this demolition is bigger because, of course, at times this demolition affect activities and economic activities or agricultural activities, and hence the impact is much larger than those directly displaced. We characterize this as part of a coercive environment that push people out of certain areas, particularly in Area C, which is the area, if you want, primarily is down the Jordan Valley here, and then in this part of the map, and then scattered around the different areas in the different cities of Palestinians. In Nablus and in Shafat, recently, due to the two attacks that I've mentioned before, we have seen a reaction from the Israeli that have basically blocked the movement of the entire populations. This is the map of the Shafat camp. So the pink area is East Jerusalem, and this is this is the border of the municipality. And the yellow part is a Palestinian community, and the blue part is Area C. So this red line is the fence, and so the Israeli Authority have closed this access from East Jerusalem into Shafat, and then they have sealed this area here, so blocking 130,000 people within the camp and preventing people to access services, essential services. Some are, of course, delivered within the camps, but others are exactly immediately outside of the camp. So access into school, and more importantly, access to health facilities and hospitals. We've been trying to negotiate with the Israeli humanitarian corridor, but we could not find any appetite on the Israeli government to have that discussion. In Nablus, this is again a picture of the situation right now. So Israeli have completely encircled the city with earth mounds, and they've closed gates, and they've closed checkpoints, and only one checkpoint at the moment, this is the Awara, is open one way, but with heavy controls and checks, security checks at the entrance, which of course delays and keep people for hours on the queue. Nablus is 170,000 people town, and so we are planning to go there early next week in order to see and assess directly the impact of this closure and restriction on movement of people, and trying to then advocate for the reopening of those checkpoints and those blockage that has been put around Nablus city. Meaning, keeping in mind the time that has been allotted to me, I will skip to the legal framework that should be. We applied the legal framework of hostilities in the case of Gaza during escalation, but in normal circumstances, the legal framework that should be applied in the West Bank is about policing. And in that case, international humanitarian law applies, but Palestinians and Palestinians should be considered civilians that should be protected by the Israeli authorities, being the occupying forces, and they should receive their protection. Palestinians that takes up arms are still civilians in the context of policing. They are not militants. And therefore, while policing forces is allowed in certain circumstances to protect life, it must be taken in a way that minimizes harm to people. Depending on the circumstances, shooting live ammunition at demonstrators, even those who throw stones, may not be compatible with this requirement. And this is one of the key elements that we are trying to advocate for. And we define this as excessive use of force. I leave aside Gaza. I mean, Gaza briefly is the problem with Gaza is movement restriction, given that Gaza is completely blockaded in the land, in the sea, and in the air. The political divide resonates with the division between West Bank and Gaza, and the major concern we have from the humanitarian perspective is the recurrent escalation of conflict. And concluding, I think for us, what is important at the moment is to find a way to de-escalate the current tension. We have asked, member states and of course Israel to promote through dialogue and diplomatic channels to promote a de-escalation of the tension, the current footprint that the army has taken across the West Bank. We advocate for secure humanitarian access, because what is important for us is to keep on delivering assistance to people, making sure that people can access hospitals and trauma centers, in particular, considering the excessive use of the recurrent use of live ammunition, and to the extent possible, minimize harm for Palestinians, because as I said earlier, the trend that we've seen of systematic use of live ammunition to control and to do public order, maintain public order in the West Bank seems to be excessive and has caused enormous injuries and fatalities in the West Bank.
Thank you. We do have a number of questions, but we'll hold them a bit until our other speakers have finished, and then bring questions forward as a whole at that time. So let me welcome Dan Owen from Yesh Din. We've really appreciated the Yesh Din briefing series, the materials that you're putting out, the research that you're doing on the ground. And we partnered with Yesh Din Rebuilding Alliance to bring forward asking Congress 2 years ago to protect the olive harvest, certainly something that needs attention again now. Go ahead, Dan, please.
Sorry.
Great. Got it.
All right, so good evening to everyone. I'm wondering if I should start with a video. So I'm just gonna share a video real quick. It's just gonna be 1 minute. That's it. Can you see? Can
Yes.
you see the soldiers? All right. Right. So this was a video of settlers and soldiers attacking the town of Hawara just last week. Hawara is situated south of Nablus. Well, violence committed by Israeli civilians against Palestinians and or their property is basically a daily occurrence throughout the West Bank. This is a widespread practice involving many Israeli citizens that include acts of violence, damage to property, takeover of Palestinian land, and all sorts of other offenses. Israeli law enforcement exhibits extreme incompetence addressing these offenses. Our data shows that most investigations by Israeli police regarding harm to Palestinians are closed due to the failure of the police to properly investigate. Most investigations of Israeli citizens suspected of harming Palestinians are closed without any indictment. And according to our research throughout between 2005 and 2021, 92% of all investigative files concerning Israeli citizens, settlers harming Palestinians were closed. All right, so already there's an inherent failure to actually deal with these type of offenses coming from the state of Israel. Now, it is worth mentioning that the Israeli military technically has a duty to protect Palestinians residents from settler violence. Under occupation, Palestinians are considered protected persons, considering international humanitarian law. However, often Israeli soldiers do not prevent attacks, but rather they stand what is called idly by, while Israeli citizens commit acts of violence against Palestinians. At times, they even aid and cooperate with settler violence, providing security to the perpetrators and attacking Palestinians themselves, just as we've seen in the video. Now, every year during the olive harvest, as you mentioned, there's a wave of violent attacks. This includes theft of crops, destruction of trees, and we are right now at the very start of the harvest, which started just last week, and already Yesh Din has recorded 10 incidents of settler violence during this harvest. This includes violent attacks against Palestinian harvesters who are being attacked by settlers, theft of the harvest itself, meaning settlers, they just have the audacity of reaching the olive trees and just stealing huge amounts of olives off the trees, leaving the trees naked and making them unaffordable. Also, there's theft of equipment that we documented, and arson, meaning burning olive trees, burning the harvest itself. Now, obviously, olive trees and olive harvest have great meaning in Palestinian culture. So this is more than just an agriculture terrorism. This is ways more. This is a culture thing. Now, the failure of the Israeli state to actually investigate and the leniency displayed by both prosecution agencies and the courts, the Israeli courts, in cases of ideologically motivated crimes, encourage and even enable these violent acts of Israeli citizens against Palestinians, meaning they can do whatever they want. Like we saw in the video, we have a number of settlers, tens of settlers, entering a Palestinian city, armed with batons, with rocks, etc. And they can do whatever they want. They know the army is backing them, and they know that even if they would be caught by the police, more likely they won't get sentenced, they won't get indicted, etc. Now, this continuous violence committed against Palestinians by Israeli citizens is part of a calculated strategy. This is not arbitrary. It aims at dispossessing Palestinians of their land eventually. Now, in the past week, Yesh Din field researchers reported a sharp increase of settler violence and growing tensions across the West Bank. The situation seems very violent and more dangerous than before. In the last week, the West Bank erupted with numerous violent attacks carried out by Israeli civilians against Palestinians. These violent developments are taking place against the backdrop of an ongoing military operation, like Andrea was mentioning, coined Breakwater by the Israeli military, that included near nightly raids. This includes near nightly raids and arrest operations in different Palestinian towns and villages, which led to the killing and injury of many Palestinians, making 2021 the deadliest year in the West Bank since at least 2015, as far as we know. In addition, for over 2 weeks, Nablus has been under intense military repression and closure. The surrounding villages are now under constant threat of military and settler violence. Some of our field researchers even mentioned this is a reminder of the grim days of the Second Intifada, when much of the West Bank was under extreme closure. Now, within the current circumstances, it is almost impossible for Palestinians living in the West Bank, and especially in Nablus region, to lead a normal daily routine, knowing that settlers can be attacking them on the roads. People are afraid to leave their houses. I was talking to people who are literally afraid to go to work because they're afraid of settler attacks happening in the past week. Now, during the last 8 days, we documented at least 14 incidents of settler violence. This is only what we recorded. There might be more than this. On the night of Tuesday, October 11th, settler violence erupted across the West Bank. This violence was reportedly in revenge for the killing of an Israeli soldier who was actually guarding a settler march in the Nablus district. In Sinjail, the same night, dozens of settlers attacked homes, throwing rocks, causing broken windows, panic, and other damage. At the Shiloh intersection, settlers attacked a Palestinian family, and the driver was injured and then hospitalized. At Kdumim intersection, settlers attacked a Palestinian vehicle, and in Itzhar intersection, a resident of Jama'in was attacked and injured. During this week, settlers repeatedly invaded the village of Hawara. Hawara is the village we saw in the video, and attacked houses with rocks, accompanied and protected by Israeli soldiers. Tens of settlers armed with batons, axes, rocks invaded the village on October 13th and began wreaking havoc, attacking shop owners, cars, and homes, and setting fire to storage units and other structures. We also received reports that settlers shot live ammunition in Hawara, which actually injured the taxi driver. On October 12th, Israeli settlers set fire to chicken coops in the village of Kusra, burning tens of thousands of chickens to death and causing great economic loss for the owners. Tens of settlers have also set fire to electric poles between the villages of Jalud and Kusra, causing severe power outages. They also damaged more than 20 olive trees, and according to eyewitnesses, they fired live ammunition. Several Palestinians were injured and hospitalized following this attack. On this Sunday, I visited the village of Urif. It's situated between extremely violent settlements, Itzhar, which is the famous one, and Kumi Uri, which is a smaller one, where on previous days, between Friday and Saturday, settlers carried out an organized attack on the village that included an arson attack targeting the village's school. The principal's office was almost burnt, and you can now see the office is half burnt. Earlier today, even masked Israeli settlers armed with batons, rocks, attacked Palestinians, Israeli and international activists during olive harvest activity in Kisan, just south of Bethlehem. 3 were injured following the attack and were hospitalized. Yesh Din's researchers described disturbing and dangerous phenomenon in which there is a growing cooperation between soldiers and settlers in these attacks. As I mentioned earlier, it is not just idly standing by, but rather assisting and helping and operating together in order to attack Palestinians. The military has been enabling settlers to embark on this revenge campaign, subjecting Palestinians to collective punishment. Rather than preventing violent attacks by Israelis, the military has been responding by intensifying restrictions on Palestinian civilians. Hawara, for instance, has an increase of soldiers inside the town right now. Sadly, the Israeli media or the Israeli public does not care much for these incidents. The Israeli media does not report on these matters at all, almost, and does not show the violence perpetrated from Israeli citizens or in military towards Palestinians whatsoever. As I mentioned, this violence is calculated and strategic. Right now, for instance, we are being told that some Palestinian farmers are just too afraid to reach their lands. They're afraid of the violence, they're afraid of being attacked, and it's not worth it for them, and therefore they cannot cultivate the land. Consequently, they're in risk of losing that land to the same settlers that are attacking them. Thus, in that sense, the settler violence, which is backed by the state of Israel, by the lack of accountability towards Israeli citizens, is actually enabling further Israeli colonial expansionism in the West Bank. And that's it.
Thank you for your work and for the work of Yesh Din. Yesh Din also files cases, right? So when you're quoting statistics, you have a sense of how many cases have been brought through the investigation process.
Our statistics are based upon cases we ourselves took and represented Palestinian victims. So this is where our data comes from.
Thank you. Let me bring forward Asil Al-Baja, who's from Al-Haq. I'm really glad that you can join us today, and please go ahead with your presentation and we'll double back to bring questions forward.
Thank you for inviting Al-Haq, and thank you for the speakers for giving this comprehensive overview of the escalations in the past month or 2 weeks. I will try not to duplicate the content and maybe try to take another perspective in terms of trying to contextualize what is the context that these escalations are happening within. So yes, we are seeing escalations in terms of numbers, trends of violations that are escalating in terms of settler violence, demolitions, killings, collective punishment, but it should be noted that these are not but a continuation of a systematic and ongoing violations against Palestinian people as a whole. So first of all, this is not only happening against Palestinians in the West Bank, but this is against the people as a whole. And second of all, that this has been ongoing for decades now. We're talking about 70 years of violations and killing and collective punishment, denial of the right to return. So if you want to put this into the bigger context, we're talking about a settler colonial regime that is interested in working on basically eliminating the Palestinian people and replacing them with a settler population. One of the tools or symptoms that Israel has been doing to basically implement the broader project is through its apartheid regime and through its occupation regime. And for example, when we look at the legal definition of the apartheid, in the Apartheid Convention, for example, one of the elements of the crime of apartheid is basically suppressing Palestinian opposition and resistance through killings and through collective punishment and through denying them from participating in the political life and many other elements and policies. So all these, when we look at them, is basically proof of Israel's intention to maintain its apartheid regime. It is also a proof that Israel has no intention to end its military occupation against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The facts on the ground tell us that these ongoing military incursions and killings and collective punishment are basically a proof that Israel is just intending to shut down any voice that tries to challenge its regime. This is not only in terms of protest or throwing a stone or holding a gun. This is also against organizations who are using international law standards and principles to advocate for justice and freedom in Palestine, including the organization I'm representing today, Al-Haq, and other organizations who have been designated by Israel as terrorist organizations. Last year, actually today is the anniversary, if you want to call it anniversary, of the designation of organization as terrorist organization. And this of course has many implications on our work, but more broadly on the missions and the mandates that we represent to basically document the ongoing violations on the ground, to conduct advocacy work in terms of, in order to amplify the voices of Palestinian people, in order to hold Israel accountable for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that are being committed on a daily basis. So I will not go much into the work of the civil society organization, and I will try to also put some maybe human story to the violations that are being committed in escalation in recent weeks. First of all, it is important. There are some analyses that are talking about that this may amount to kind of a third uprising or the continuation of the uprising from last year. And here it's important to note that last year, for example, in May, when Palestinians from all over Palestine were mobilizing and protesting in the street peacefully to assert that they are one people and they are entitled to exercise and realize the right of self-determination against one broader regime. So Palestinians from the West Bank, from the Gaza Strip, from within, inside the Green Line, and Palestinians also, refugees and abroad, were all in the street and calling for an end to this regime. They were all met with violence as well. They were met with killings, they were met with mass arbitrary arrests, they were met with collective punishment. Israel conducted a military offensive on the Gaza Strip. So we're talking about how Palestinians are trying to basically overcome and challenge and oppose and resist this broader regime in every single mean. And last year they were met with suppression and violence. And so this year we're seeing a continuation of this spirit of unity and resistance by the Palestinian people. And if we also shed light or focus on who is mainly leading these Palestinians who are now protesting and being killed and being subjected to all this kind of violence, it's mainly youth. And we're not talking about youth my age, but children. So if we just want to look at, for example, statistics from the killings of this month, October, I think the first 2 weeks, if I just may have 1 minute, first 2 weeks, Al-Haq documented 15 killings in the West Bank. 7 of them are children. And also not the rest of the 15, so 7 children, the rest of them are mostly also youth, so in their early 20s. So these Palestinians or youth, it's important to understand that they were born in a context or a generation that they had never been in a process of political participation, never had the chance to, opportunity to elect their representatives. They are systematically and deliberately excluded from any space to be represented or to have agency to voice their demands. And so this is one of the factors. In fact, they were born post the Oslo Accords, or the supposed peace process that were supposed to fulfill or to facilitate a better future for them. But since then, there has been an expansion of colonization, an expansion of violence and systematic killings and restrictions of movements. So this is the context that they were born in. And if we even shed light on some of these communities that the escalations are now happening in, so we're talking about Jenin and Nablus. Jenin, for example, the Jenin refugee camp is specifically one of the communities that military incursions are now systematically happening. Killings are systematically happening in Jenin as well. And in this context, these are Palestinian refugees who have been denied their right to return since above 70 years. This is the context. And more than that, they have been living in a prolonged occupation for above 50 years. And in their childhood, as they were being brought up, they were raised and they witnessed massacres. So not only killings. In Jenin in the Second Intifada in the 2002 was subjected to basically a massacre. So these are the children that were brought to this context, and they continued to basically to be subjugated to killings and freedom of movements. Their family members have been either killed or imprisoned or injured. And so we're talking about a generation that is full of anger, frustration, specifically that there's no international community to back up or to support their demands. And when we're talking about the role of the international community, this is not about politics, but this is about legal obligations that because of Israel's crimes against humanity and the gravity of these crimes, it necessitates also obligations on third states to basically step in and implement concrete actions to bring the situation to an end. And this includes sanctions, so imposing diplomatic sanctions on Israel in the context of the US, of course, stopping the military trade that is now killing and supporting and facilitating the violence against Palestinians. So these are some of the steps that should have been done long time ago. And we're talking about 70 years of inaction. And other actions that could be done is basically to support the ongoing file at the International Criminal Court, which is really essential to address and end Israel's impunity, as well as bring justice for the Palestinian people and ensure that there's some deterrence to Israel's crimes that are being committed on a daily basis. I will not take long, but I would like
I'd like you to go ahead and wrap up because we have a number of questions.
Yes, just one last moment is that actually, when we talk about the role of the international community, one of the frustration by the youth as well is that there's double standards when it comes to the Palestinian people. So when we're talking I don't like to make, like to compare between who is the victim. There's a victim here and there's a victim in another context, but it's more about the role of the international community in taking actions in other contexts. This should be done in every context where international law violations and crimes are being committed. And in the Palestinian context, it is not so. And also in terms of discourse, like even when we talk about how the Palestinian people are framed and their actions are framed, and how the Israeli actions are framed, we're not talking about two equal parties. We're talking about a colonial power that is committing an apartheid regime and an occupation regime. We're talking about colonized people who have the right to resist by all available means as enshrined by international law and UN generally assembly resolutions. So this course is not used for the Palestinian people, but in other contexts, it is supported. I will end here and maybe leave it to questions, and sorry if I took longer.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your presentations. What I want the audience to especially think about are places where they feel engagement with Congress can lend some safety, justice. We found in our experience that focusing on particular incidents, you can begin to prevent a demolition. You can prevent the worst from happening if Congress gets involved and asks questions about a place. And this is, we've been extending it to people and groups as well, this type of approach for very focused interaction. So panelists, if you have anything like that in mind, take on this. That's certainly appreciated. And I'd like to move toward this larger set of questions. Matthew, I think you've been formulating, like putting them in order. Do you want to take the lead, or I also see some that I would move forward with?
Yeah, I can do that. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the questions that are in the Q&A function. The first one's from Gretchen, and this was written when, Andrea, you had your graph up where you were detailing the number of killings this year. The question is there a breakdown of settler compared to IDF killings?
Yes, there is. I put on the chat the link to our website and the database, so where you can find all these distinctions. For this year, out of the fatalities we have recorded, 3 have been directly attributed to settlers. 1 is disputed, and the other are from the IDF. But you can also see the historical data on our website. So feel free to look at that.
Okay, thank you. And the first couple of questions were written when Andrea was talking, but I'll just break them up a little bit so we can hear from some other speakers. There's a question it's from an anonymous attendee. It's, what role is the Palestinian Authority playing in all this? They've been reading that the Palestinian Authority is also not observing human rights and is feared. So I think this question can really go to any of our panelists as what role is the Palestinian Authority playing, and what is the situation with the Palestinian Authority and human rights in Palestine?
ASIL may be the best place, given that they are covering human rights for all, from all.
Yeah, I think in terms of, it is right that with the question that the PA or the Palestinian Authorities also has been and is committing violations against the Palestinian people, especially in terms of rights of freedom of expression and political expression of Palestinians and freedom of assembly. And now in the context when there is escalation against the Palestinian people and what is happening right now, unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority does not take actions that could de-escalate. Maybe I would say does not have the authority or power to de-escalate the situation. Israel, unfortunately, does not respect even the accords that it has signed. So when we're talking about the West Bank, for example, 60% of the West Bank is classified as Area C, which is under full Israeli military and security control. And that gives it the power to basically move more comfortably and implement its security measures more comfortably. But what Israel does is that it treats all the West Bank as its own sovereign. And so there's no respect for these classification and the military incursions actually, which are happening in Jenin and Nablus, and the killings are most prominently happening in areas A and B, where the Palestinian Authority supposedly should be having a power. I think also one of the negative roles by the Palestinian Authority is that there's under the Oslo Accords as well, there's the security coordination file where the Palestinian Authority is actually facilitating some of the arrests that Israel is intending to conduct against Palestinians in the West Bank.
Thank you, Asil. Our next question is from Marta. Marta is asking, actually Marta has a couple questions. I'll try to summarize them here. It's, does the United Nations have the capacity to declare something equivalent to martial law to protect civilians in refugee camps, etc.? And then also are personnel from the UN providing immediate reporting on the situations we're seeing happening? If not, who provides that information? So Andrea, I think that's a question for you. What capacity does the UN have to protect people in the occupied territories?
So thank you, Marta, for this question. And in fact, it resonates with something that Asil and even Dan has spoke earlier, which is a little bit the sense of frustration that the Palestinian has vis-a-vis the international community, including the UN, to be honest. And that's because the mandate we have is not able to put any martial law around this. Is the occupying forces that have the control of the territory and the ones that could and should protect Palestinians. During the tensions last year, and again recently in these weeks in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, we have been very much frustrated about this. Our mandate does not allow us to be a bit more forceful and present in situations in the imminent situation of tensions, and this is something that, you know, in my mind, that thought at times, would that be one of the way forward to be a bit more present with a mandate that allows us to in fact do a little bit more be a bit on the front line. What we do, in fact, is thanks to the likes of Yeshdin and Alak and other colleagues, is through a network of NGOs that works with us, and then with our staff that goes out on the ground to verify incidents. Is we'll verify this information, and we put together reports that are, you know, systematically fed to the Security Council, member states, diplomatic community, with, of course, with the government of Israel and with the Palestinian authorities also, when they are the ones violating rights of Palestinians. But I genuinely believe that there is an issue of how can we be a bit more forceful in our ability to protect better Palestinians. It is a big, I think, limitation of ours. And we want to preserve our ability to deliver humanitarian assistance. But the protection element, I think, is probably one of the weak rings of the chain, if I can say so.
Thank you, Andrea. Asil, would you like to follow up on that? I see your hand is up.
Yeah, maybe just to add some things on the UN. In terms of protection, I do agree that there's no ongoing role for the UN in terms of protection, but maybe there are some stuff that could be done to ensure protection for the Palestinian people at different levels. I would say if we start at the level of the UN Security Council, which is the most effective body that could basically provide protection, and not only protection, but could address Israel's impunity and colonial power and occupation. The Security Council has the role to mobilize and implement sanctions against states if they are committing systematic violations against the UN Charter and so on. And this is something impeded by political circumstances. The other body, which is the United Nations General Assembly, and this is something we have been pushing for as Palestinian civil society, is trying to basically put pressure on the General Assembly to reconstitute the Special Committee Against Apartheid, which was a prominent body during the apartheid regime in South Africa, that was responsible and contributed to ending the apartheid regime. And this is something that the Palestinian civil society has been pushing forward and has not been also taken into consideration. The third level, which is the Human Rights Council at the UN, has also some capacity or spaces to provide protection for the Palestinian people. This includes, for example, accountability mechanism at the Human Rights Council, specifically, let's say the UN database for companies that are operating in the illegal settlement enterprise. And unfortunately, while this mechanism has been launched 3 years ago, I'm not sure about the number, but it has not been, as per the mandate, updated annually, and it should be updated annually because it is a mechanism of accountability, a potential mechanism of accountability to ensure that these companies divest from illegal settlement enterprise or bring their actions in compliance with human rights. Another mechanism of accountability mechanism at the Human Rights Council is the UN, is the Commission of Inquiry that was established last year. And this is a very important body because it is not only responsible for investigating crimes and violations that happened last year in May in Palestine, but is also responsible in investigating underlying root causes of what is happening in Palestine, including historic Palestine, so not only the occupied Palestinian territory. And potentially this body, this Commission of Inquiry, could be a body that could mobilize into recognizing the situation in Palestine as it is in order to address it the way it should be addressed.
Thank you. I want to bring forward also some mechanisms in the United States specifically. So one thing, and this is important to keep in mind, those who are doing reporting, in the United States, there's a law called the Leahy Law. It's one of the few around the world that looks at the misuse of munitions, of arms. And it requires that when there's been a gross violation of human rights, that the U.S. must cut off the aid and training from the unit involved at the smallest level until the perpetrator is brought to justice. So all the work that Justin has been doing about the status of those cases actually becomes really important in this Leahy Law process, provided that we know who the unit is. So as you're reporting, put down the name of the unit. It triggers the mechanism one way or the other. Now, does it work well in this case in Israel and Palestine? No, it does not, for a variety of reasons. But what we've noticed in bringing a case forward for a child back in 2007 and being asked to go to the evaluation meetings with the Leahy Department of State and the Pentagon is that they are noticing where they're flawed, why they're blocked from bringing this forward, and they are looking at ways to implement better solutions in Israel and Palestine. I think that this is an important law. You'll see it especially now in the next few months with regard to Shireen Abu Akleh's case. Hopefully that will force the implementation in that context. And again, these are still after the fact, though. Things that can prevent violence, things that open up any form of any way that we can begin to establish trust. Those are really important now. We'll want to, certainly speakers, as you see any place for motion, safety, something that tangible and relatively small that an individual member of Congress can do because constituents ask them, please relay to us. We'll continue to do the same on our side. And now I promised everyone it would be an hour-long briefing. There are many more questions left. And maybe our speakers might stay a little bit longer, but I do want to thank everyone for being on the call with us. We'll make the recording available. We'll also be providing our usual approach, very important. Congress takes action because you as constituents ask them to. It's your request that moves them forward. They'll listen, they might come to briefings, and they do. We see, like, each time we bring forward a campaign, about 50 to 70 congressional offices, both Republican and Democrat, come to those briefings one-on-one. But the thing that motivates their action is your letter, your call, your presence on a briefing. We really value that and want you to stay as informed and as involved as you possibly can. You are the reason they take action. So my biggest thank you is to everyone who's who's joined us in this discussion, and a deep thank you to our guests as speakers for joining us, the Rebuilding Alliance team who's been helping make this happen. All of us, thank you very much. And we'll stay on for maybe another 10 minutes, if that's all right. And Matthew, back to you with questions.
Thanks, Donna. The next question I want to get to, Wally has a couple questions on here. I think these, Dan will let you have the first response on these. I'll kind of summarize them a little bit. Do Israeli Jewish citizens support Israeli settlers and their supporters and enablers in the army? And where do most of the violent armed settlers come from? Is it true that many of them come from the United States? So Dan, if you'd like to answer a little bit about what the support is amongst the Israeli citizenry for settlers and the army.
Where do I start? So after over 50 years of occupation, Israel managed to completely normalize the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. Many Israelis don't even view the Israeli control as occupation. We are that far reaching in that sense. So Israelis, I mean, you can see nothing has changed over the last years. Israelis do support the Israeli occupation. And just as Asil said, this isn't something new. I mean, the occupation is one event over 70 years of Israeli control over this area. So in this sense, the occupation is in many aspects a continuation of the very same thing. So it's very difficult to get Israeli citizens to resist the occupation or even think in terms that are critical towards the occupation. There are elections coming soon in Israel, and it seems like even more right-wing parties are now gaining more power. The fascist parties, even, if I might add. But again, I might be a little cynical here, but it is really just the continuation of the same ideology, of the same thing in the first place. Having said that, also many Israeli kids go to the army as it is mandatory, and being educated that protecting Israel is important, and they reach the army and they actually take part in as soldiers in the occupied territory. In other words, they are taking part in a crime. So it is very difficult for them to later acknowledge. I mean, for criminals, it is very difficult to acknowledge you committed a crime and then go against the same that crime. So I think Israel managed also to create a situation in which many of its citizens are accomplices of this crime. So in any case, I hope that answers the question. Also caught me in the day, which I'm not very optimistic, obviously. Concerning the identity of settlers, yes, I encountered many settlers coming from the US, but actually the vast majority of settlers are actually, if you consider, for instance, what most Israelis consider to be neighborhoods of Jerusalem, but are in fact settlements. If you consider the big settlements like Ma'ale Adumim or like Modi'in Eilit, these are the largest settlements of Beitar Eilit in the West Bank. Mostly these are Israelis who are coming from lower middle class background, and the settlements are a great economic way to, it's a great economic solution. In that sense, again, I'm taking it back. What I'm trying to do is, what I was talking before about settler violence, I was focusing on settler violence, but many times settler violence acts to overshadow the greater violence, which is the violence of the state of Israel and the army. And obviously, like Andrea said, that the military causes much more deaths and much more violence than settlers. It is sometimes easy to focus on settlements and the settlers. It is in fact, you have to go back and see who sent them there, and you always get back to the state of Israel. Having said that, acknowledging the fact that many Israeli settlers are coming from, middle, lower class background, means again, the state is using these people to settle, to colonize, etc., like many states did before. So in that sense, it is rather a fact on the ground already. The settlements, it's within the Israeli society, you hardly see any opposing voices to the occupation anymore.
One of the prevention mechanisms that's coming up now in the olive harvest, if it worked like before, the army should have met with the farmers to explain what the rules will be, what type of permits they might need to get to their olive trees near settlements. If they haven't had that meeting already, let us know about it, what they're saying. And then asking Congress to, on a day-to-day basis, we need permission to get someone in, or they're being blocked from their field, or their field is being damaged. Maybe those would be immediate interventions that we could ask for. And in a way, it's an entry point. Telling the bigger story through that very focused approach can be a useful way for these congressional offices to actually do something more than just listen.
So this actually starts tomorrow on the 20th. So we expect to have more incidents to be able to document, or even use you guys in order to put pressure to help eventually Palestinian farmers reach their lands. But this is going to start only tomorrow. Up until now, farmers wanted to reach the olive or to harvest did it without coordination with the military.
And I guess one question we can keep asking, and it sounds really small at a time like this, but just asking Congress to make their call to the Israeli embassy to assure that the farmers will reach their crops, like, and ask for what kind of assurance is being promised. Like, it's this way of demonstrating that someone on the outside cares about this. Can we do something similar with the blockade of Nablus? Can we be asking for this to be lifted, or to assure humanitarian corridors in? Andrea, you said you're going next week, and you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I was thinking that, you know, one of the opportunities that the tragic event of Shireen has brought to the attention of the American public is the issue of impunity. Because, you know, we can work on specific cases and try to address the specific. And I think that in some cases, your intervention, Donna, with colleagues of Rebellion Alliance have been fundamental to protect. But the real problem, one of the fundamental problems is this constant impunity of events that happens across the West Bank. You know, impunity for military, for their action, impunity for settlers, for their actions. And I think that this is a very, you know, clear demand. And, you know, the amount of documented violations that every single organization in operating here, from, you know, Yesh Din, Al-Aqsa, but many others have, it's phenomenal. The problem is that there is no action. And this is one of the things that may turn around the wind. This year is a particular year. This year is 15 years of the ceiling, the construction of the wall. Is 20 years since the construction of the Gaza, 20 years since the construction of the wall all around West Bank, and 55 years of occupation. So this 15, 20, 55 should be marked in a way that is also looking at the, you know, the illegal regime that is being put around, which is not only the wall, but is also all the regime of permits that you were referring at. You know, those have been considered by the International Court of Justice illegal, and Israel is not simply taking any action, and is all, you know, and again. It's for me, accountability and impunity is one of the key questions that constituencies should ask for this place.
Thank you. And Asil, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to also add to what my colleagues have said on what could be asked in the US context, but also in other states, is that yes, it's important to provide constant protection in terms of facilitating, for example, the movement of Palestinians to their lands to harvest their olives, but this is not what Palestinians want, basically, because if they are allowed to enter their land this year, next harvest, the same thing will happen. Settler violence will continue. Maybe the slot of the land that they are allowed to enter this year will be confiscated next year, or will be burnt by a group of settlers. So this is why it's important to address the root causes of the problem. The main demand should be the settlers should not be here to begin with. The settlements should be dismantled and demolished. Expansion of settlements should not continue. Laws that permit, the discriminatory laws that are facilitating the apartheid regime should be repealed. The refugees who are inside the Jenin refugee camp should allow to return to their homes in 48. These are the demands that should be addressed, because if we address the immediate protection and we turn the question of Palestine into a humanitarian question, this is a colonial context, this is a people under colonization. If the problem is solved for this specific month, a continuation and the cycle will continue each year. And this is not like being over optimistic and imagining things that are, you know, radical. This is a legal obligation on third states. I'm repeating myself, but it's because we have been repeating this for decades, that we want concrete actions that could bring the overall situation and the overall regime to an end against the Palestinian people as a whole.
That could bring the offenses of the regime to an end. Or both. You're on mute.
Sorry, what's
your closing sentence? Is it to bring a regime to an end as a whole, or is it to bring the offenses of the regime to an end?
The regime, and this was my whole this is why I intervened, because I think if we bring the offensive and the violations within the regime to an end, this does not bring justice and freedom to the Palestinian people. The problem is not that there is a demolition here and people who are being subjected to displacement over there and people are being killed over here and people are being collectively punished. Yes, this is a problem, but the problem is that this is being committed in a systemic colonial context. And in these contexts, in colonial context, the colonial power does not have the intention to end these violations that are happening within the regime. And so dismantling or ending the regime should be addressed by certain recommendations. When we say allow the refugees to return, this is a fundamental condition that could basically address the root causes. Because to begin with, there should be no Palestinian refugees for 70 years in the Jenin refugee camp. They should be allowed to return to their homes. And if we're talking about the Gaza Strip, same thing. We're talking about, I think, about 70% of the population in the Gaza are refugees. They should not. The blockade is illegal, it's collective punishment, but they are also refugees who have been denied to return to their homes. And each year or each couple of years, they are subjected to a military offensive. And so if we do not address these root causes by, for example, repealing discriminatory laws that allow for the denial of the Palestinian right to return, and allow the exclusive right for Jews to enter Israel and be granted automatic citizenship. And there are a lot of laws and discriminatory policies that basically allow for the confiscation of Palestinian land, allow for the disposition of the Palestinian people, while they expand the settlement enterprise, not only in the occupied Palestinian territory, but all over historic Palestine. So these are the things that should be addressed, as well as ending the occupation, all the occupation. So by withdrawing the settlers from the OPT, by stopping the settlement construction and expansion in the OPT, ending the military checkpoints. We should not say we want to facilitate the movement, maybe like increase the hours of opening in the checkpoint. No, there should not be a checkpoint to begin with. So these are the things that should be addressed and asked for the US Congress, for all states to basically step in and implement actions to bring to an end.
Thank you. I'm going to ask as a closing comment from each of you, if you would speak to where do you find hope? And I know, Dan, you said it's hardly a day to ask about hope, but search deeply. What keeps you holding on here? And I'll ask Asil for you to go last on this. So maybe Dan, Andrea, and Asil.
I think eventually, I'll just go ahead and start. I think eventually the international community has an enormous power to make change and to force Israel to make huge changes. I think the US specifically has a lot of power. Israel is very much dependent on the US. Asil mentioned the arm deals, but it's more than that. Israel is basically very much dependent on US support. So I'm guessing where I see hope is precisely where I feel the international public, there's a shift towards Israel. It seems like people all around the world might be sick of it, might be changing their minds. I'm being hopeful here. I'm giving the optimistic version, obviously. Including also Jewish communities around the world, which I think are also changing their minds, changing their views upon the state. So having said that, this might help eventually, to change. But that's as hopeful as I can get.
Andrea, to you for a closing statement.
I think that the hope remains with the young generation, the youth, in Palestine, in Israel, and across the globe, because they are the ones that have been able to bring powerfully last year, famously they are Kurds, but not only, light back into Palestine. But I also believe that they are the ones who can look forward and not looking only backwards, because that's the only way out for this conflict. Only Palestinian and Israeli have the keys of these solutions, the solution between the two entities, and the youth across the globe have the power to mobilize the conscience and making sure that international humanitarian law and human rights prevails, not only for Palestine, but because it's bigger. I keep on thinking that the problem here is not only for Palestine. The violation of international humanitarian law is not only impacting on Palestine, but is for the next crisis somewhere else. So I really want to believe that the youth will be the ones that will help us to move forward.
Thank you. And Asil, please go ahead.
I think what I have been inspired by as a Palestinian is last year's Unity Uprising, which was led by Palestinian youth and younger generations. And what is inspiring about that is that it is people-led, it is grassroots-led. There's absolutely no political parties involved in the mobilization, and the amazing mobilization that happened last year, whereby Palestinians defied and addressed above 70 years of fragmentation, and managed to basically unite as one people and say in one voice that we are one people who want our freedom and self-determination, and we want to bring to an end to this colonial regime. And what is happening now is also a continuation of the Unity Uprising. What is happening in Jenin, what is happening in Nablus, in the Gaza Strip earlier this year, is also a manifestation of the unity of the Palestinian people. So hope is in the unity of the Palestinian people, it's in the youth, and hopefully not more killings and violence would not compromise the will and the power and steadfastness of the Palestinian people.
Thank you. Thank you again to all the speakers, to our guests on the line. There'll be news about COGAT policies. I see that question. It's coming out tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, our time, perhaps we'll have that response on that for those of you who are following the entry issues. Thank you again, everyone who's been on and joining us. Much appreciation to our speakers.
Thank you very much. Donna, can I say something about the regulations? Given this is one action that I think is very, very close for constituencies to bring to the attention of congressmen and women and senators. This is one, yet again another way to erode the space for Palestinians. And I think that this is one regulation that should be simply rejected completely. Unfortunately, not all member states are taking these positions. They are negotiating to fix the most egregious aspect of it. But in fact, it should be simply sent back to say it's not legal. It's not done for the best interest of Palestinians, and it should be rejected. And I hope that this will be the line that US will also take. It's important, and this is actionable, actually.
Thanks.
Sorry,
that's really helpful. We're really following it. We've done, Hadijah's led about 40, and Nejma too on our team have led some 45 briefings so far. And many members of Congress are paying attention to the regulations and intervening on behalf of their constituents. So very specific interventions. Also, we've watched the State Department and our Congress turn away from individuals who are blocked from entry because of discrimination. So really important that there be a clear path on this, and that it not get lost in the visa waiver program approval or denial, that in and of itself, the regulations need to be opposed, and very clearly, as you've said. So we'll certainly be working on that. Everyone's watching to see what happens tomorrow. And all the best on all of these things for those who are impacted. So thank you again, everyone. I'll go ahead and close. I will be sending out maps, copies, reports, links to the things that you've been hearing about here. I want to make sure Andrea writes down his 15, 20, 55 analysis for us also. Many thanks, Cecile, for your presentation. Man, I wish we could get to that level. And in the meantime, keeping people safe and alive has been a focus for us as well. So thank you very much. And Dan, good to hear your voice. I'm glad to see what Justine is bringing forward. Really important resource.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers. Bye-bye.